Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Valley Best Shalom. I'm Rabbi Noah Farkas. It is our weekly Pirke Avot class, and it's a wonderful book of study about ancient ethics for modern times. And tonight, I will be very excited that we have tonight's class plus one more week's class, and then I'll be taking a vacation for 2 weeks. A couple of announcements, really important, coming up. This Friday night at 6 p.m., Kabbalat Shabbat, our campus is tentatively opening. If you'd like to come to that service, it will be outside. You'll be required to wear masks, and you'll need to register on our website. And the way to do that is go to vbs.org/Shabbat. And right there will be a list of protocols you'll have to follow and how to register for services for Friday night. I really do hope you'll be able to join us. Other announcements coming up. As I said before, I'll be taking a couple weeks off, much needed time away fishing. In fact, I'll be up in Big Bear for a few of those dates. And so I want to give a special shout out to Valley Best Shalom member and Big Bear resident, Mr. Jack Elliott, who is just having a great time up there, although he'll be driving up north while I'm there. I just want to give you a special shout out, Jack, and that sorry, I'll miss you when we're up in your neck of the woods, so to speak. All right, everyone, we're going to begin our class this evening. So if you are joining us on Facebook, as I'm hooking up the Facebook link now, glad that you're with us. We're going to please feel free to make comments and questions through Facebook, as well as in the other place like YouTube, for example. And we'll let us know you're here. Let us know you're joining us as we begin teaching. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as we prepare our class for tonight. Okay, so this is the text for tonight. Just to give us a recap of where we are in the class, we are studying one Mishnah a week from Pirke Avot, and we are now in towards the end of chapter 1. And tonight we'll actually be studying two midrashim, or two mishnayot that are back to back, because they are very clearly related to each other. They are both said essentially by the same rabbi, so we paired them together. And as we begin to prepare for tonight's study and how we approach what is the central topic for tonight, I want to go back to a couple of verses in the Bible that provide some real grounding. And it has to do with impartiality and about judging people fairly. Okay, and if I remember that Pirke Avot itself is a text that is meant as a manual for up-and-coming Torah scholars who became judges, literally judges over different cases, but also over Jewish law, and that the Mishnah is meant to give guidance to them. So that is what Pirke Avot's about, and tonight we'll be focusing very closely on impartiality. And there's about 3 verses from the Torah that matter around this. I'm going to show you 2 for the sake of brevity tonight, but they're very important. Now, in the meantime, I just want to say hi to Cheryl, who's joining us online, and Jack as well as to Mark. Really nice to have all of you with us. And Rebecca, it's really nice to have you with us too. And Natalia, always great to have you. This is not from a Sidor, it's from a website called Safaria, where I make a lot of my source sheets. Wonderful nonprofit organization that has tried to put all the Jewish texts you've ever heard of online in one location in Hebrew, Aramaic, and English, and searchable, very easily searchable and compiled. Okay, so this is what we're going to look at tonight. Let's take a look at the book of Numbers and the book of Exodus. And Book of Numbers, it says, the second clause is what's important here, but basically it says when you enter the land, you subdue the land, and you take possession of the land as God has commanded it. And then when you return, you shall be clear before the Lord and before Israel, and this land shall be your holding under God, under the Lord. So here is like a couple of really, really important things that are tied together. The first is the word in the Hebrew for being clear is naki. And in modern Hebrew context, the word naki also means to be clean, not just clear, but clean. Like if a room is clean, it's been cleaned, it is naki. That's the Hebrew word for it. Here it means to be clear. And if you notice what the Bible is trying to tie together for us, it's this idea of being free and clear has something to do with the support of the land itself, right? It says that you shall be clear and clean before the Lord, before Israel, and this land shall be your holding under God. So these are the two things that come together, is that there's something about the quality of our moral character and the establishment of the place that we live. And you'll see how this will play out later in the Mishnah and in subsequent Talmud and Midrashim. But those two ideas, which begin in the Bible, will play out very powerfully moving forward. So just put those two ideas in your mind. That one is to be an upstanding person, to be clean and clear. And that usually means from suspicion, that you are living the life, that your mind and your heart and your actions all match each other, and that somehow that establishes the land. Okay, so that's the first two things. The second one, which is even clearer, is from the 23rd chapter of Exodus, chapter 23. And it says, do not take bribes, for bribes blind the clear-sighted and upset the pleas of those who are in the right. So the word for bribe is shochad, shin chet dalet, you can see there. And it says, you shall not take a bribe because the shochad is itself a blinding attribute. It blinds the clear-sightedness, and it upsets the pleas of those who are doing right, those who are tzaddikim, those who are righteous, those whose claims are righteous. Now here, two ideas are also brought together. First is the idea of bribery itself, which again, to just define it, that is receiving some kind of reward or payment or something. And as a judge, you're not allowed to do that because it makes your eyes blinded and upset those who are trying to do things that are right. So both it harms the judge because the judge is no longer clear-sighted, and it harms those who are righteous, those who are looking for righteous claims. Now, it goes to say that in our city today, this very commandment has led to the infringement of this commandment has led to the arrest of one of the city council people who is accused of doing exactly this, which is taking bribes for political favor. And I can't think of another Mishnah which is more apropos given the political situation with a sitting city council person in Los Angeles being arrested at his home this very morning. All right, now let's take a look. I put these two Mishnayot together because, as you remember, in Pirke Avot, each Mishnah in the opening chapter is from a chain of transmission, and both of these are attributed to the same person, which is why they're together. So this is Mishnah 8 and Mishnah 9 of Pirke Avot. Yehuda ben Tabai v'Shimon ben Shetach kiblu mehem. Yehuda ben Tabai omer, al ta'as atzmecha ka'orecha hadayanim, ukshehiyu ba'alei dinam ondim lefanecha, yehu be'enecha kerisha'im, ukesheniftarim milfanecha, yehu be'enecha kezakain, keshiblu aleihem et hadin. And then the second Mishnah says, Shimon ben Shetach omer, have marbe lechkor et ha'edim, v'have zahir bidvarecha, shama mitocham yomdu l'shaker. So Judah ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shetach received the oral tradition from the generation before them. Judah ben Tabai says, do not as a judge play the part of an advocate. And when the litigants are standing before you, look upon them as they were both guilty. And when they leave your presence, look upon them as if they were both innocent. And when they have accepted the judgment. And then Shimon ben Shetach used to say, be thorough in your interrogation of witnesses and be careful with your words, lest from them they learn to lie. Here are two incredibly important maxims about how to be an impartial judge. Judah ben Tabai says that when someone comes before you, you should interrogate them and you shouldn't trust what they have to say. But once judgment has been adjudicated, you should accept that judgment and that the truth has been meted out. That's a very deep statement that we'll have to go into some real decent conversation about, and I'll get to it in just a moment, about what it means to portray yourself or to have the people in front of you think about themselves as guilty from the minute they walk in and innocent from the minute they walked out. And does that concept of being a Rasha when you come in, an evil person when you come in, and a Zakai or a clean or an innocent person when you walk out have anything to do with the judgment that was made. That is to say, if a judge judges you guilty and you are guilty when you come in, you're still regarded as innocent when you leave, which I'll get to what that means in a minute. It's very complicated, but very interesting about how we approach the world. Now, what Shimon ben Shetach wants to add to this is that the same doesn't just go for the those who are interrogated, those who are the plaintiffs or the defendants in the case, but those actually goes for the witnesses too. That the witnesses themselves have to be very thoroughly investigated. That is to say, they have to be regarded as possibly lying to you. So you have to be very careful with how you interrogate them because you don't want to lead them into perjury, and you certainly don't want to give them the opportunity to say something that is untruthful. Okay, so those two Mishnayot come together. Let's start with the first one. Okay, let's take a look at Bartanora, our favorite commentator on Pirke Avot, has to say about being a Rasha or being a Zakai. So here, under the rubric of they should be like evildoers in your eyes or Rashaim in your eyes, he says, so that your heart is not inclined to one of them, saying such and such one is important. He is, and he would not make a false claim, since if you were to say this, you cannot see him as guilty. The idea being is that the disposition of someone who comes in and is standing in front of you, and you're trying to judge them and their character, Yehuda ben Tabai's understanding, and Bartanora tends to corroborate with this, is that you can't just bring in the fact that they're a professor or that they're an upstanding business person or that they are a rabbi or a priest of some sort, that they are a good standing individual, a school teacher even, and that they stand before you, and you shouldn't just let their reputation be the thing that guides you in how you judge them. We would call this in modern American sociological practice being very careful of our confirmation bias, of understanding that when folks present themselves to a court or to be interrogated in some way, that we have to be very careful that when we're looking upon them, that we don't just prejudge the situation because they're wearing nice clothes or because they're a man or because they're white or because they're wealthy. We have to understand the facts of the case as it's laid out before us. And the way that it's phrased in the Mishnah is that the judge has to look at each person almost as if they're guilty already, or evil already, not necessarily guilty of the crime, but they themselves are capable of doing something that is illegal. That is a different disposition that we find in the United States, where you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. Here, it's not saying that you're necessarily guilty, but you're capable, because each and every one of us is capable of doing things of which we would be found guilty. So it's not, again, the judge in this case is not adjudicating from the minute they sit down whether or not this person is guilty or innocent. It's about whether or not my bias is going to lead me to a verdict that might say that they're guilty or innocent simply because they're confirming other assumptions that I have about them. Now, when they leave the courtroom, when they leave the place of being interrogated and whether they've been advocated for or not, Bartanora says, and here's his comment about when they receive the judgment, such that you should not suspect the guilty party of saying this one was a robber, but rather say, maybe he was mistaken and didn't intend to rob. And also, another possibility is that one of them has become obligated to make an oath as a result of testimony and do not say that he made a false oath. The idea behind both of these ideas, of these clauses that Bartanora is bringing up, is that when justice is meted out in the courtroom, or that's true, I think, not just in the courtroom, but in any time we have a conflict, once judgment has been handed down, a decision has been made, we immediately go from thinking the worst of people to thinking the best of people. That's the difference in the Mishnah's mind between vengeance and justice. Vengeance means that when justice has been meted out, when the judgment has come down, that we now continue to define the rest of this person's life by the worst thing they've ever done. That they're going to be evil because they're a felon. Instead, the Mishnah is reminding us that even the person who is guilty of the crime, even the person who has made that huge mistake, should be regarded that his soul itself is innocent. And that it doesn't mean that he shouldn't be punished for the crime, whether making restitution or, in our case, being incarcerated, or maybe even getting the death penalty. But because of what the Mishnah is saying, is that from the minute the judgment has been meted out, that person should be regarded in the best of all characters and not the worst of all character. That's what Yehuda ben Taba'ai, using Bartanora, is trying to teach us. So what do we learn from this Mishnah so far? We learned that the disposition of the judge is that he, in this case but he or she should not take a bribe, should not act as an advocate for a particular plaintiff or defendant. And that means that you have to be very scrupulous in how you interrogate your witnesses, as well as the particular parties that are part of these claims. And once the judgment has been meted out, some truth in that sense has been uncovered. And when that truth is uncovered, we switch from being so judicious in how we understand people to being more full of grace. And even that does not mean that they're not guilty. It just means that they're not evil. And that's a very, very, very important distinction, because we often confuse the two. That when someone is convicted of a crime, let's say a nonviolent drug offense, for example, we've now completely defined them as a human being, as being a felon or someone who was an ex-con, for example. And that's the difference between punitive justice and what we call restorative justice. Restorative justice means that you're meted out the punishments, but then they're allowed to come back into the community and you try to embrace them as a whole human being. Now, I want to now begin to refocus on what it means to be a judge in this situation, because so much then is dependent on the judge. And in the Talmud, we see over and over again these wonderful use of the language of both Numbers and Deuteronomy, Numbers and Exodus, that play out the story of what it means to be naki, clear, and what it means to not take a bribe at all. So in the 105th page of Ketubot, it says, Rabbi Abahu said, "Come and see how blind are the eyes of those who accept bribes and how they ruin themselves. If a person has pain in his eyes, he gives a doctor money. And even then, it is uncertain whether he will be healed or whether or not he will not be healed." Right? So when we go for treatment and you give the doctor money for your treatment, you don't know that you're necessarily going to be healed from this particular treatment, but you still pay the doctor for their expertise anyway. All right, so that means that a doctor is receiving funds, some kind of money from you, even though you don't know what the outcome is going to be. You're paying for their effort, right? Their expertise, their learning. And here they say, well, how different is a judge than a doctor? And yet those judges that take value of a peruta, which is a very small piece of money, as a bribe, as getting money from one of the sides of the case, and actively then blind their eyes, as it's stated, for a bribe blinds those who have sight. The sages taught, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise, all the more so it would blind the eyes of fools. And it perverts the words of the righteous, all the more so it would pervert the words of the wicked. So are fools and the wicked suitable for judgment and to be appointed as judges? Rather, this is what the Tana of the Baraita said, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise. Even if he were wise, but he took a bribe, he will not leave this world without suffering blindness of the heart, i.e., he will eventually turn foolish and perverts the words of the righteous. So think about that for a minute, right? The idea of a bribe, you give the money to a doctor and you don't know what the outcome is going to be, but you give the money to the doctor for the effort. Even if you were to give the money to to judge a bribe of some sort, and he doesn't find in your favor because you're not sure of the outcome, it's still considered illegal. It's a different kind of category because we hold doctors and judges to different levels of scrutiny, of conflict of interest. A doctor uses his judgment to figure out what the best part of care is for you. In the Hippocratic Oath says you should do no harm, that you should care for your patient, etc. But for a judge, you can't be that invested in the people in front of you. And specifically, that's what our Mishnah is referring to. So here it's saying, though, that even though you might not become blind physically, right? It says you'll become blind in your heart. And that if you serve as a community leader and you take a bribe of some sort, you become a fool. And you've perverted the actual foundations in which we all build our society. And then they go on to say in Ketubot, a long series of what bribes entail. And I didn't include all of them, but I just want to give you a sense of the breadth of what it means to take a bribe and therefore no longer be impartial. So here it says from the previous page, it says it confounds or perverts the works of the righteous. Even if he's completely righteous, but he took a bribe, he will not leave this world without becoming torn up as a human being. And here they give an example. When Rav Dini came from Eretz Israel to Babylon, he said to Rav Nachman Bar Kohen, who interpreted this verse homiletically, and he says, what should written? The king by justice establishes the land, but he who exacts gifts overthrows the land. That is to say, if a judge is like a king, i.e. that he can serve as a judge, if he is like a king, that he does not need anything and is not dependent on anyone, he establishes the land, i.e. he can serve as a judge. But if he is like a priest who seeks out various forms of sacrifices from the granaries and collects them in order to, because making him dependent on other people, he overthrows the land. So that's a really, really, really interesting idea that the king and the judge have to be independent from the society in which they live. Now, that's not how our society is currently built. It's certainly not how our congregations are built. If I was independently wealthy, I would still do this work for the congregation, but I am dependent on salary. My kids still need to go to private school, and they still need to. I still would like to make sure that I have hot water running through my house. But the idea here is that the judge, in the most crystal sense, has to be so independent that they can then make a fair judgment, and by doing so, establishes the land, establishes a foundation upon which everything else rests. Now, remember what I said about that from the book of Numbers. Anyone who is themselves naki, who lives above suspicion, who doesn't try to say one thing and do another, especially when it comes to business practices, family relations, and civic responsibilities, that they establish the land. They give us this terra firma that we can all stand on and feel like the world has some permanency and some truth. And you can see, though, today, more than any other time I've ever been alive, that terra firma feels very shaky. That's because we have community leaders, both liberals and conservatives, who do one thing and say another, and who aren't impartial, and who make everything overtly political. And because of that, righteous causes themselves get muddled up in political battles unnecessarily, and we all feel that the world is a little bit less stable because of it. And so here, the Mishnah is really, really important because it's saying, and that line from Bamidbar, from Numbers, is really important because it's saying that in order for us to feel firm in our community, in our belief, in order for us to feel like we have something to stand on and then reach for to the sky, the people who serve our community, the people who serve at the very front, the people who are most public, have to be the most transparent, and they have to be the most human in that sense. And that's not what we're experiencing today. Now, let's go back to bribes, because this is all the section about bribes, and listen to what how strong the prohibition of taking a bribe is, and maybe to prove how hard it is to even reach this level of righteousness. So Rava says, what is the reason for the prohibition of taking a bribe? Because it says, once a judge accepts a bribe from one party, his thoughts draw closer to him, the person who gave him the bribe, and he becomes like his own self, and a person does not find fault with himself. So the Gemara then notes that this is a play on the word shochad, which means bribe. The word shochad is the Hebrew again for the word bribe. It can be read as shehu chad, that he is one. That is, he is aligned with one of the litigants. So the word shochad and shehu chad is just a play on the words to strengthen the argument that you become aligned with one side over the other. Now, it goes on to say, Rav Papa said, a person should not judge a case involving one whom he loves, nor involving one whom he hates. He should judge one whom he loves, as he will not find any fault in him, and with regarding to one whom he hates, he will not find any merit in him. This is the Talmud playing out the very thing that we found in Yehuda ben Tabai's in the Mishnah. So this is now Rava and Abaye, so we're now talking a few hundred years later, and they're playing out the very same system we find in Pirke Avot. That anyone that you adore, you shouldn't be the judge over, and anyone that you hate, you shouldn't be the judge over, because you need to treat them equally. Now, Rava's a partner, Abaye, said, with regard to this Torah scholar who is beloved by the residents of his town, it's not because he's a superior sage than others. Rather, it's because he does not reprove them in heavenly matters. He is beloved because he's not so strict with them with regard to the observance of mitzvot. One of the things that Abaye says, which I actually really resonate with, is that the goal of being a rabbi and a teacher and a judge is not to be loved. It's easy. You can go along as a rabbi. You can go along with whatever your congregants say, whatever your students say. You want to go out on Shabbat? Fine. You want to eat treif? Fine. You want to break the mitzvot? Fine. You're loved because you've never told your congregants to be better. You've never asked them to achieve something more. And Abaye says that it's okay, you can be beloved. But Rava then says, well, at first I would say that all the residents of Mechoza, which is where he worked, loved me. However, once I became a judge, I said that some of them hate me and some of them love me, as I assumed that their feelings toward me depended on the success of their case. And when I saw that the one I declared guilty today would be found innocent the following day, I realized that my rulings do not determine their attitudes, and therefore I said if they love, then they all love me, and if they hate, they all hate me, regardless of what happens in the courtroom. Of course, that's partially true. I would say that to add to that really, popular rabbis, really popular teachers have plenty of people who don't like them, especially if those teachers and rabbis ask something of their congregants. That the goal of public leadership is not just to be adored, but to be respected, that you stand for something. And that those things, and that to be a truly great public leader is not to hold animosity in your heart for people who disagree with you, because you might find them guilty today and innocent tomorrow. But the goal is not to not have people who don't like you. The goal is to stand for your principles and in some ways be impartial in those principles. And then it goes on to say about bribes and extends it, I think, even much more powerfully. The sage is taught, and you shall take no bribe. It's not necessary to say that this includes bribery by means of money. However, even verbal bribery, assisting by means of speech, is also prohibited. The halacha that a bribe is not necessarily monetary is derived from the fact that it's not written, and you shall take no profit. The Gemara asks, then what are the circumstances of bribing with words? So how do you bribe someone with words? And the Gemara gives on to give several examples of strange bribes. For example, it can be demonstrated by that an episode involving Shmuel, who was once crossing a river on a narrow ferry. So imagine a river, and Shmuel's trying to cross it, And a certain man came along and gave him a hand to help him out of the ferry boat. Shmuel said to him, "What are you doing in this place? Who are you? What are you doing?" The man said, "I have a case to present before you in judgment." And Shmuel then said to him, "Well, I'm disqualified from presiding over your case because you did me a favor." Here's an example where no money changed hands. A man was helping Shmuel out. I guess he knew who he was. And Shmuel immediately says, "Well, I can't judge in your case because you did something nice for me, and I might not then be able to overcome my bias when you stand before me." So, anytime that you're trying to change someone's bias towards you, according to this story, that's considered a bit of a bribe, even if it's not financial. Here's another case. A Maimar was sitting and judging a case when a feather floated and landed on his head. A certain man came by and removed it from his head. And the Maimar said to him, "What are you doing?" And he said to him, "I have a case to present before you." And the Maimar said, "Well, I'm disqualified from presiding over your case because of the favor you performed for me." So imagine that you're standing there and a feather dropped on your head and you're having in the middle of a big lecture and someone nice comes up to you and says, let me just help you out, right? It's like that the dad thumb, right? Those of us who are dads know the dad thumb. Your kids got some like ketchup on their face and it's a thumb and you're like, "Let me just help you out here," right? Doing that for someone else, helping someone else in just even the smallest amount would in a Maimar's mind and the Talmud's mind disqualify the judge. And has nothing to do with financial gain. It has everything to do with bias. There's two more cases I want to bring. Number one, there was spittle, some kind of spittle lying before an Amora whose name is Mar Ukva. A certain man came by and covered it over. And he said to him, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I have a case that's present before you." Mar Ukva says, "I'm disqualified from presiding in your case." And so here in Mar Ukva's case, it's even more severe. Nothing is happening directly to the judge. Let's say there's some, I don't know, some puke or something on the ground or whatever it is, and someone came and covered it up to there wouldn't be a mess in the middle of the public square. And Mar Upa, who is deriving benefit from that covering of whatever that mess is, disqualifies himself. He says, "I'm going to recuse myself because I benefited from your action. I want to remove my bias because you're coming before me." And here comes, I think, what is the most interesting and complicated. So Rabbi Ishmael, who is one of the more wealthy rabbis, had some land. Okay, and on his land back in the day and all the way up to the beginning of the 19th century, we had sharecroppers. That means that you would work the land, and as payment for working the land for the owner, you would give them a certain amount of the crop. You would sell it, and you would use that for rent. And while it's not a great system, it was a way that very poor people, especially poor farmers, would be able to make a few bucks. So there was a sharecropper of Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, who was accustomed to bringing him a basket full of fruits every Friday afternoon. And one day he brought him the basket on Thursday instead of Friday. And Rabbi Yishmael said to him, "What is different that you came now, earlier in the week?" And the sharecropper said to him, "Well, I have a case to present before you." And I said to myself along the way, "Well, I'm coming over anyway. So since I'm coming over anyway, I'll bring the basket of fruits to my master." And Rabbi Ishmael said, didn't accept the basket of fruits from him. And he said to him, "I'm now disqualified from presiding over your case." And Rabbi Yishmael was seated, a pair of rabbinic scholars, and they judged the sharecropper's case. And as Rabbi Yishmael was coming and going, meaning he wasn't actually presiding, but he was coming and going from the courtroom, he said to himself, if he wants, he could claim this. And if he wants, he could claim that. Like in his mind, he's running through how he would argue the case differently, right? He kept thinking of all the ways in which a litigant who brought him the fruits could win his case. But he said to himself, "Blast the souls of those who accept bribes. If I, who do not accept anything, and if I had accepted, I would have accepted my own property. As it is, my sharecropper and the fruits legally belong to me, and nevertheless, in this state of mind, due to the proposed gift, all the more so are those who actually accept bribes." So imagine this case. Rabbi Ishmael gets this basket a day early from his own sharecropper. And he rightfully decides to disqualify himself. He recuses himself from the case. And then later in the afternoon, the case is being adjudicated, maybe even on his own farm. And he's imagining how his sharecropper, the person who lives on his land and works his land, could win his case. And whatever, it doesn't even matter what the case is. And he realizes in that moment, he's playing armchair quarterback for his own sharecropper who's in this case. And he realizes that, what it means to be impartial is to recuse yourself as quickly as possible. Even in this case, even in this particular case where the sharecropper himself is sharing rightfully owed property to Rabbi Ishmael. It's not that Rabbi Ishmael doesn't own the crops already, right? He owns the farm. So if you got a basket of fruit from your own farm, would you consider that a bribe? And for him, it did, because what it did is it's not about the money. It's about the bias. It's about the perception of the person in front of you and whether or not all the other elements that come into that room cloud your judgment. And here he has a relationship with the sharecropper, so it's almost obvious. But we have to go on to say that each and every one of us goes through life with what we call implicit bias of how we think about other people. And if I've never met this person who comes before me before, but they look nice, they're well coiffed, they speak well, they smile and look me in the eye, I'm probably going to assume certain things about them. And if they don't have any of those attributes, I might consider them in a different category in my mind. All of this is implicit bias, and we know how this plays out in courtrooms. We know how this plays out with technology. We know how this plays out with criminal justice. That implicit bias privileges some people over other people, either because they're rich or poor, or because they're men or women, or because they're black or white. That in those cases, implicit bias, we prejudge people. So much information is shared with us before we ever actually meet someone that we prejudge that information before whatever comes out before in front of us, whether we like it or not. And the Mishnah is trying to teach us to remove our implicit bias. And what a powerful thing to say 2,000 years ago, and we're still trying to learn that lesson today. That when someone comes before you, if you have a young black man in a hoodie pulled up over his head, our implicit bias is to read him as dangerous. And if you have a young white guy wearing a collared shirt tucked in, our implicit bias is to judge him as not dangerous. When we know from mass shootings across the country, the exact opposite is actually true. And so I just want to put that out there, that the Mishnah is teaching us, Yehuda ben Tabai is trying to teach us that the most important part about being part of witnesses or the litigants is to remove our implicit bias. I want to turn this inward for the last part of our class. What does it mean to have implicit bias for other people, but what about having implicit bias for yourself? What does it mean to think about how you walk through the world and what you carry as your own bias about who you are as a human being? One of the greatest things you learn about psychology is that when you begin to have feelings about your feelings, you can end up in some pretty wild and crazy and dark places. The minute you think that you're an evil person, not just someone who makes mistakes, but you believe in yourself that you are an evil person, you begin to act that way. The minute you believe that the whole world is coming to an end and that you are depressed and you tell yourself, I'm depressed and I'm a depressing person, then you're going to act out of that depression. It's very hard to then turn the tables and say, I'm not going to act that way. And the same is true for people who have dispositions which are more positive. If you're very a joyous person and you say, I think I am a joyous person, I think I am a nice person, I think I am a loving person, then as you act out in that world, as you act out with other people, you're going to be confirming the bias you have for yourself as you act it out in the world. And what's very jarring for most people is that you think you're one way and other people think you're a different way. Like, let's say you pretend you're the introvert, right? And you think you're a very happy, lovely, joyous person. But the language you use to express that is more introverted. And then people come to you and say, why are you sad all the time? Why are you quiet all the time? Right? So each one of us has this bias, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, which helps us shape who we are as a human being. And so what if we were to not just take this Mishnah from Pirke Avot and apply it to other people and how we judge other people or how we shouldn't judge other people? We actually turn it inside. We turn the whole thing inside. We turn a mirror upon ourselves and we say, how am I judging myself in this conversation? And so for that, you have to look to Maimonides, who is one of the greatest Jewish philosophers ever to live. He wrote just a ton of work, very prolific his entire life. And so what I want to look at are the laws of repentance, which are wrapped up with Rosh Hashanah. And I just want to let everyone know in this process, we are farther away from the beginning of this pandemic than we are from Rosh Hashanah at this point. We're 100 and something days away from the beginning of the safer at home, the quarantine orders, and we're only about 90 days away from Rosh Hashanah. So we're actually closer to Rosh Hashanah in this process than we were before, which is obvious, but we're actually closer to Rosh Hashanah than we were to the beginning of the pandemic. So I don't think it's too early to talk about Rosh Hashanah. So here he's saying, and here he's referring to the shofar, which is that ram's horn we blow to ring in the new year and talk about the importance of it. And so here he says, notwithstanding the blowing of the ram's horn trumpet on Rosh Hashanah is a scriptural statute. It's something that we have to do. The blast itself is symbolic. It's as if saying, ye that sleep and bestir yourselves from your sleep, and those who slumber emerge from your slumber, examine your conduct, turn in repentance, and remember your God, your creator. They that forget the truth because of their vanities of the times, or who err all of their years by pursuing vanity and idleness, which are of neither benefit nor of salvation, care for your souls, improve your ways and your tendencies. Let each one of you abandon the evil path and his thought to which is not pure. It is therefore necessary, he says, for each and every person, kore et adam lirot et etzmo, to see themselves throughout the whole year in light of being evenly balanced between innocence and guilt, and look upon the entire world as if evenly balanced between innocence and guilt. What Maimonides is saying is that you are neither evil nor good. You're neither guilty or innocent at any given moment. You are evenly balanced between the two. And in fact, the world is evenly balanced between the two. Don't have a presupposition that everything is bad or everything is good. Thus, because if you did, then if you saw everything as evil, then if you did something evil, you're not adding much to the evil sort of pot, if you will. And if you saw the whole world as good, you're not adding much to a world of goodness. So he says, if you see everything being balanced right in the middle, then it's that moment where your actions matter the most. Your actions matter the most. So he says, thus, if you commit one sin, you'll overbalance yourself and the whole world to the side of guilt and be a cause of its destruction. But if you perform one mitzvah, one duty, one act of loving kindness, and you can overbalance yourself and indeed the whole world to be on the side of virtue and bring about his own or her own and their salvation and escape, even as it says, according to Proverbs, but the righteous is an everlasting foundation. It is he by whose righteousness he has overbalanced the whole world, and the virtue will save it. Because of this matter, it became the custom of the whole house of Israel to excel in almsgiving and good conduct and performance of duties and mitzvot and acts of loving kindness during the intervening days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, above what they do during the whole year. It also became a universal custom to rise early during those 10 days and deliver the synagogues in prayer and supplication and in ardor until the dawn of the day, that is to say, until Yom Kippur. So what Rambam is adding to us, to this Mishnah, in my opinion, is what we found in the book of Numbers and in the book of Exodus. That we cannot take bribes either way to judge other people fairly, and more importantly, that the world is established on how we see our inner lives. That if you see yourself as a dark person, you'll have a dark life. And if you see yourself as a bright person, you can have a bright life. But the truth is, neither of those stories comport with reality of the actual world in which we live. And Maimonides is trying to teach us to not prejudge everything that we have in our world, and to live as if you are 50% dark and 50% light. And at every given moment, you can edge the world 1% in one direction or 1% in the other. And so I will return to the Mishnah to close tonight on what it means to be an impartial judge. Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shachtaf received their oral tradition from them. Judah ben Tabai said, do not be as a judge and play the part of an advocate. And when the litigants stand before you, look upon them as if they were both guilty. And when they leave your presence, look upon them as if they were both innocent. And when they have accepted judgment. And if we were to extend that beyond the bias we have for other people, we extend that upon ourselves and say, when we enter into Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we can enter as if we know that we are guilty, and we'll leave knowing that we are innocent, that we can be judged in those days, but we are never, ever judged permanently based on the worst thing we've ever done, that we are better than that. And Shimon ben Shattach adds that when it comes to the witnesses, that you shouldn't lead them to lie as well. And so I want to kind of end on that tonight we looked both at impartiality of how we judge other people, that we try to leave our confirmation bias aside, and that we try to remove our implicit bias of how we judge other people that come before us and may scare us or help us. And that ultimately, when we turn inside, we turn to that place where each and every one of us live, that we have to judge ourselves and also be kind to ourselves as we move through this pandemic and right up to Rosh Hashanah. And so I'm happy to take a few questions now, comments from our group who's gathered here online before we close out. Anyone have a question? Anyone on Facebook have a question? Because I'm happy to take questions from there too.
Rabbi Farkas, I had a question. Salon.
Hi, Ilan.
So the question is having to do with the definition of a bribe, and whether the relationship that the judge has with someone whose job depends on his good favor. We've plenty of things like that happening in government now, but that doesn't involve money. Maybe it involves pressure of some sort. Is that also a bribe?
I think according to the Talmud, it is. That is to say that anytime any action is taken where someone who's adjudicating a case, let's just say, is taken to either create a positive or negative disposition by that judge, which could also include consequences if, like for example, if you decide you're going to judge against a particular person, and now you're afraid of the consequences that you personally, or maybe your family member even, would get from doing that, that would be considered a bribe in a non-monetary sense. I think, does that make sense? Like that if the fear of reprisal, because you're doing what you think is right from someone who is either as powerful or more powerful than you, is itself considered a a bribe in the sense that you would be forced to align your judgment with one of the litigants.
And that applies to reputation also?
It seems like it would. I think that these 4 cases that we took, Rava, Amemar, Rabbi Yishmael, and Shmuel, that those 4 cases had something to also do with being freed of the suspicion of being bribed, even if they weren't bribed explicitly. If a feather falling on your cap is enough for you to divest yourself from a case because of your own reputation and the need of being impartial, I think all the more so the reputation of being either praised or blamed unnecessarily so, or even more so if there was coercive power in that relationship, either to promote you or demote you or fire you or require your resignation or require the resignation of someone you love or someone you're close with, that itself is also considered to be, I guess in this case, bribe. It really is conflict of interest, but for the sake of this argument tonight, you can label it as a bribe too. Okay, so I want to thank everyone for being on with me tonight. I hope everyone's well. And just remember that next week we'll have one more class. I think we'll even be able to finish this first chapter next week, if I recall correctly, and then we'll take a couple weeks off. I hope everyone has a lovely night.
Bye. Thank you.
Good night.